Hello, and welcome to a podcast on what is a Xeriscape haven. I will be posting this podcast to my YouTube channel as well, which I will mention at the end and perhaps add a tag or something. We'll see. I'm Amy Johnson, and I am actually also creating this video recording slash podcast for the purposes of my meetup group, which I just took over organizing here in the Metro Denver, Colorado area. That meetup group has been about gardening even before I got involved. Now I have changed the name to Xeriscape Havens, so I thought it would be helpful to talk about what I mean when I say Xeriscape Havens and what I don't mean. Excuse me. So I just wanted to talk about Xeriscape in particular because there are a lot of misconceptions about what that means. Xeriscapes are often called xeroscapes, and that's almost literally what a lot of people mean when they say that. They generally like to just take out all their plants and put down probably some weed barrier and then some rock on top of that. So if you've seen it after the fact, you may not realize there's weed barrier underneath, and you primarily see the rock on top. The problem, there are multiple problems with this. One of them is the fact that when you get rid of the living plant matter and you put down rock, it makes the soil and the whole area, the little microclimate around that area, hotter. The rock just soaks in the heat from the sun and radiates it back out, and the whole area gets hotter. So if you do have some plant matter left, like even a tree, maybe a few shrubs in one spot or a few plants, it will be even more difficult for those plants to thrive, even survive. Another problem is the fact that the whole reason you're doing this is because you want to save on water. And that's an admirable goal. Yet any trees that you have around there are going to suffer because they also benefited from the water that you were giving to the other plants there. I'm not saying that you can't find low water plants. We'll talk about that in a moment. But when you just have rock, people generally don't water at all over that rock area, and the tree roots go a pretty long distance, generally the same distance as the branches above. So that gives you an idea of the area over which they like to try to get water. Oftentimes there are sidewalks next to those areas where the trees are, so they're not getting water from the sidewalk area because that's impermeable. It's an impermeable surface. Water cannot penetrate the sidewalk generally, unless there are a lot of cracks. So adding the rock and then not watering that area causes even more difficulty for the trees. Another problem is that the weed barrier and rock are not all that effective in reality at keeping weeds from growing. Some of you have probably seen rock areas that seem to stay completely weed-free for a very long time. If you haven't done this yourself, you may not realize that the way they're actually keeping those areas weed-free is by using broad spectrum herbicide like Roundup. And you may or may not be aware of all the problems that they are gradually discovering with the widespread use of Roundup. So, not only can that Roundup or broad spectrum herbicide cause problems for our entire earth, but even just in that area, the trees can suffer from it. Any plants nearby can suffer from it. If the plants don't die, which sometimes they don't, and in fact, they're actually breeding and genetically modifying plants so that they can survive Roundup, so that you have only the plants you want growing. And this might sound like a great idea. However, those plants still take up the Roundup, the herbicide. And if they have a flower, which if they're any kind of plant, they do have a flower, even if it's not something that you recognize as a flower that's very showy, the bees are going to come and they're going to suffer from exposure to the herbicide that that plant has taken up into its system. So if your tree has started having problems, those are two reasons why that may be if you have some rock area around. The weeds generally, as far as the weed barrier is concerned, go around it. They grow on top of it. There's dirt that gets on top of it, so it's not that hard to grow, and they can even grow through it. It may make them slightly less prevalent, but it it is a nightmare to remove weed barrier fabric. Those of you who have done so can back me up on this. So a lot of times people just only find out after it's too late how difficult it is to prevent weeds from growing just using weed barrier and to then get rid of it once you're tired of it. So if then you do get rid of it with lots of work or paying someone to do it, a lot of money probably, whatever, then you will also probably discover that that soil is no longer quite so fertile as it once was. Not only has it probably been exposed to herbicide, not only has it not had as much water as it did before, but also because the plant material was removed from that area, there is no longer the carbon in the soil. And potentially not even as much nitrogen as it would have had, not because you are necessarily fertilizing the plants that were there, but for example, clover is a fairly common volunteering plant that grows in areas even when it's not planted. And clover is a great nitrogen fixer. It has little nodules on the root systems. It's in the legume family, Leguminaceae, and it fixes nitrogen into the soil just naturally by the very nature of how it grows. So that can also be missing from an area where you have removed all of the plant matter. By the way, I have a degree in landscape architecture. I grew up on a farm and I have a lot of experience in arid climates in particular, which is why I'm focusing on xeriscapes today. I live in Colorado, as I mentioned before, and so I've seen a lot of this kind of thing happening, and that's why I'm so knowledgeable about these different aspects of what can happen in arid climates. So, what are the alternatives? What can you do instead? And how can you create a haven for yourself, for pollinators, for maybe your children, friends, family, even your business potentially can truly benefit from this. Having a nice, green, lush, beautiful landscape can help your business if you happen to be in that kind of setting where you actually have some landscape area. So there are alternatives. There are great alternatives, actually. They do require a little bit of care, but probably not much more, possibly less than if you were to try to manage weeds by spreading herbicide and then somehow manage to try to, keep the trees growing and healthy. Those problems that I just listed are likely to create more work for you than if you are able to work more with nature as opposed to essentially waging war upon it, which is what happens with all the things I just listed. So you may or may not be able to identify plants, but there are ways to do so and to start getting better and better at it. Of course, you can always hire a professional, but I want to try to describe to you some of the weeds that you may want to focus your efforts on versus maybe allowed to grow because this is nature here, even though they're weeds and even though they may be growing primarily because the soil has been disturbed, has been maybe abused in some ways. Weeds are the ones that grow in those areas that other things don't necessarily grow so easily in. So let's talk about that first. Number one, I already mentioned clover. Clover is a great one to allow to grow and not necessarily pull it as a priority. You may not always want it to grow there. You may want to reduce it at least in the future, but in the near term, it's better than allowing some of these other more noxious weeds to grow. And when I say noxious, I mean weeds that really choke out the other kinds of plants that you want to grow. And that includes natives a lot of times. So clover is one of them. Dandelions may be one of them. You may not want dandelions, and that's totally okay if you don't. But dandelions are okay in a limited quantity. If they're growing in an area that has been treated with herbicides, you don't want to try to eat them, at least in the first few years, probably. But many of you may know that dandelions, every part of them is edible as long as they're not contaminated with herbicides and that kind of thing. So they can be a nice one to allow to grow if you're okay with that, especially at your home where it's okay, especially in the backyard. Another one might be salsify. That's a little bit of a harder one to identify, but it also has a yellow flower. It does get taller than the dandelions. So if you have ordinances in your area that prevent you from having weeds over a certain height, you want to definitely keep that one to the backyard. Salsify also makes the same kind of seed head that a dandelion does, only bigger. So it gets those little seeds that can kind of blow away and go far. So some of your neighbors may or may not necessarily appreciate it, but if you have a big enough yard and it's not necessarily right at the edge, it can be a good one to allow to grow. There are trees that will volunteer to grow, and if they're not in a good place, then they would be considered weeds, probably. Bad places for trees to grow are too close to building foundations, I would say 10 to 15 feet, depending on the size of the tree. And of course, that depends on whether you can accurately identify it. So when in doubt, try to go 15 feet out from a house before letting a tree grow. And you kind of have to stay on top of those. So it's helpful if you can begin to notice the things that start turning into, like woody plants, trees, essentially, and sort of nip those in the bud. They will happen, but that's okay. If they're really easy to pull when they're young, but as soon as they start getting a little bit more of a trunk to them, they start getting a little woodier, then they can be really difficult to get rid of. And you don't want to have to grind a stump if you can avoid it. And I think those are the main ones I wanted to talk about keeping. The ones that you want to try to prioritize in terms of hand pulling, most likely. And it's okay if you don't necessarily get all the roots on these, just kind of chipping away at them is a good method for some areas at least, probably smaller areas, are bindweed. I think a lot of you are probably going to be familiar with that one. Creeping Charlie might be another one, although I wouldn't prioritize that one as much as bindweed. Creeping Charlie is in the mallow family, so it has a little bit of a mallow leaf and a mallow flower if it ends up blooming. Whereas bindweed is in the morning glory family and has a smaller flower than a morning glory, but white or kind of pinkish, and that viney, twining sort of growing habit. So that's how you can identify that. It's very common, it's very vigorous. So you want to try to get that in the spring as soon as you know that's what it is. And if you think it might be, you might want to go ahead and just pull it right away. Another couple of weeds that you want to try to stay on top of most likely are cheatgrass, which is also known as smooth brome. And this can be a little bit difficult to identify, especially if you have any other kinds of grasses growing nearby, but it tends to be a little lighter green, tends to get taller faster than the other kinds of grasses that you might like to have. And then if it does go to seed, it has these sort of drooping, dangling seeds. And maybe in another podcast, I'll attach some pictures or links, but you can Google these names too if you want to see pictures of what they look like. Cheatgrass or smooth brome is a fairly flammable type of grass weed. So that's one of the reasons you want to prioritize it. The other reason is that it's an annual, which means that it will not come back every year unless the seeds drop and it comes back from a new seed. So the actual roots of the plant do not produce a new plant each year. Only the new seeds do that if they're allowed to drop and, you know, plant themselves basically. So it can be really gratifying to pull those before they drop their seeds and to get rid of the seeds somehow. Feeding them to goats is one great way if you happen to have any goats nearby. Smooth brome or cheatgrass is not toxic to them. Whereas if it's cows or horses, they will just poop out those seeds and they'll go ahead and grow again somewhere. So that's why goats are so good. If you have the option to safely burn them, that's another option, but please be safe. Don't just go burning things if you don't really know what you're doing. Otherwise, bagging them, just trying to be really cautious about bagging them and disposing of them that way so that they don't propagate themselves. Another kind of grass is crabgrass. This one is a little more distinct because it just really sends out these, I almost want to call them rhizomes, but I know that's not the right term for this. It just sends out shoots, I guess, basically, really far. And it becomes very flat, unlike other grasses that tend to grow up and more vertically. And then if they do go to seed, those seeds come at the end of those shoots, I guess. And they're kind of more in rows of seeds on those heads. So that's how you can identify them. Crabgrass, again, is an annual. So if you can get it before it seeds and sends off those seeds to go create more plants, then it can be very gratifying again to get those and nip them in the bud. If you have a larger area that you really don't want to use herbicide for, I mean, there are some slightly safer versions of herbicide, but most of them are going to have some impact, most likely on pollinators such as bees, butterflies, etc. So if you just really need to clear a larger area, then you can use cardboard. It's not going to be 100%, and it may or may not be as good as weed barrier for this purpose, but it will be better than weed barrier because, and here I'm talking about like fabric. Plastic is really rough too, but the cardboard is more of an organic material, so it won't prevent the water from going in, and it'll just sort of help allow the soil to um, keep its organic matter to some extent and prevent those weeds from finding as much daylight as they would have otherwise. But the very number one best way to prevent and choke out basically weeds is to find other plants to start growing there. And that's why I started talking about the kinds of weeds or plants volunteering that you might want to let grow if it's the right place and if you're okay with it. Those plants that I mentioned are great. There are different kinds of clover that you can actually plant. If you start with seeds, that can work, but it can also take a little time. So you will have to keep weeding more so, before, while those are trying to take hold. Planting with starts, whether it's a really small 2.5-inch pot or, larger types of plants that you can get going. If you can find ground covers, that can be really helpful. They may not choke out the weeds 100%, but ground covers will do the best job in terms of spreading more quickly and being a plant that is better than the weeds, especially like bindweed and those that I mentioned. If you have a large area, it might be helpful to get some sod professionally installed, because the problem with seeding, as I mentioned, is that you really have to be diligent about the hand pulling the weeds and even understanding which ones are weeds. It can be very difficult while you're waiting for a lawn to start simply from seed. So that is an option. If you have it professionally installed, they should probably have some recommendations that they can offer you in terms of soil amendments. Soil amendments help the plants that you want to grow more, grow better and grow well, so that they can better choke out the weeds and hold their ground essentially. There are different kinds of sod that you can use in arid climates like ours here for a xeriscape. And by the way, xeriscape doesn't mean no plants, as I think I've already explained, and it also doesn't mean that everything takes very little water. You can have a small area of plants that take more water. You just want to keep them concentrated together so that you're only giving that extra water to that concentrated area and not the entire landscape, or not large areas that are just completely mixed with plants that need more water versus plants that need less water. That's really the foundation of what Xeriscape was always meant to be. So there are different kinds of sod that take less water than Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is the sod that has traditionally most commonly been planted for lawns across the United States. It needs quite a bit of water, although there are some varieties that take less water. You can look into those if you would like. And excuse my sinuses, by the way. There's smoke in in the area right now as I'm making this video, so I can't really help it. But there are also different kinds of lawns that you can use in addition to the other varieties of Kentucky bluegrass that take less water. And they're just all kind of on a spectrum, so you have to do a little research and find out exactly how much they need. Buffalo grass is a great one for needing very little water. You can do it with seed, but it's very difficult, as I mentioned. You can also get it as sod, and it does much better if you're putting down sod of buffalo grass that's already sprouted, already gotten started like that. If you're not really tilling up the soil that much and you haven't done that much weed control before you put it down, it may still need weeding, and you'll have to figure out which ones are the weeds, but it'll be much less than if you started from seed. Blue grama or side oats grama are two other types of grasses that can make a decent lawn alternative to Kentucky bluegrass. Also, there are some kinds of sheep fescue that also take less water. Sheep fescue, however, if there is any kind of foot traffic, if you're using the lawn to play on, especially with kids, then it may take a little more water in order to recover from that use. So again, you can do some research and find out which ones are best for you and your situation. And then I also talked about ground covers before. There are other kinds of lawn alternatives like that. Clover can represent one of those alternatives. Personally, I like to mix it up, but you might want to just, take it one step at a time. And the advantage of doing it that way is that you have the time to learn about the plants as you plant them and see how they grow, see how well they do, see how much space they take up over maybe a year's time after starting with a few. And then you can add to it with whatever you think might do best next. Grasses don't really support pollinators very well either, and that's why I would suggest sticking with only the area that you really need and want as grass. And I understand that people don't feel like they can find different plants to plant over the entire area, especially when they're not using seed. And I'm not saying that you can't use seed, you just may want to pick a small area to start with so that it's not overwhelming in terms of the need to pull those weeds by hand. Um, what was I going to say? So yeah, the area that you need for play, and if you're really going to have a lot of foot traffic, then you may just want to go with a low water variety of Kentucky bluegrass. And if you don't go with Kentucky bluegrass or you go with a type of fescue, tall fescue tends to need quite a bit of water actually, but slightly less than Kentucky bluegrass. It also depends on how much you mow it. So if you can allow the grass to grow 2 weeks between mowings, that will allow the root system to get deeper, access more water on its own, and not need you to irrigate it so much. Okay, I think I have talked about all the different things I wanted to, all the different details I wanted to hit. But to give just sort of a wrap up and a larger view about Xeriscape havens, maybe you can begin to see already a haven is a place that has things growing, and you may find some native volunteers if you just give it enough time and wait to see what comes up. Dandelions are not native. I'm not saying that they are, but there are natives that take more water. So just be careful when you seek out native plants that you are actually also finding ones that take less water. Sometimes when people say natives, they um, they actually just mean low water plants, and those two things are not necessarily the same. There are natives and there are low water plants and there are native low water plants, and there's an area where those meet, but it is not universal across the board. So havens have a place where I believe humans can thrive. As I said, pollinators can thrive, children can thrive, animals can thrive. And you do have to be careful with certain plants too, natives included, that are maybe toxic. And if you have animals or children that may try to put things in their mouth, you also want to be careful of that as well. For example, delphinium, or also called larkspur, is one that is toxic, and yet there are native varieties of that. So if you have any growing, don't let your animals or your children put it in their mouth. And don't feed it to any goats, please, or other animals. So Xeriscape does not mean rock. That's really what I wanted to make this episode about, and just basically debunk that myth that that is what a xeriscape is. That's a xeroscape, perhaps very few or maybe zero plants, but it is not very environmentally friendly, and it's certainly not really a haven for people. Whereas there are lots of wonderful plants that can grow and create a haven for all of us, and many wonderful ground covers, grasses, and perennials, flowering plants that will cover the ground for you. You can always add in some stepping stones there if it doesn't feel like enough to walk on. But there are some perennial ground covers that also are called steppables, and they take a light amount of foot traffic as well. So I hope that has helped, and I thank you so much for watching or joining me today, and I will talk to you hopefully soon. Take care.